Good. Our present this afternoon is going to be on the VTRANS 2040 sketch planning for exploratory scenarios. Our honor for today is Lorna Parkins, who is the Vice President at Michael Baker International. Lorna specializes in relationships between transportation, land use, and economic development, and has managed a variety of projects varying in size up to $5 million in contract value. She's been with Michael Baker International since 1998. Lorna holds a Bachelor of Art degree in Planning Urban Affairs from Virginia Tech and a Master's of Science degree in Applied Economics from the University of Minnesota. Join me in welcoming Lorna.
Thank you. This is Lorna Parkins, as he just gave in that lovely introduction. Thank you. So I'm going to walk through some material this afternoon that explains how we're looking at 2040 in the VTRANS process. As many of you may be familiar, we have in the VTRANS 2040 process a couple of different components, and as we look out to 2040, we determined that it was just going to be more challenging than perhaps it has been in the past to really try to say definitive statements about what 2040 forecasts look like and settle in on one agreed upon future. And one reason for that is that there's a lot of trends going on that are real game changers, and that's what this slide kind of represents, that there's sort of a tangled mess of trends that are changing people's behavior, changing their values. You see things like supply chain dynamics, the sharing economy, driverless vehicles, urbanization. These are trends that are making it very difficult to agree on what 2040 looks like. And so a way to overcome that obstacle is to look at scenarios. So we agreed a while back to do that, and we've been working towards this process for a while in the VTRANS effort. Some trend drivers that we look at are demographics, economics, environment and energy trends, and then technology and mobility. And the reason that we look to scenario planning is kind of represented over on the right hand of this graphic, that there are shifting values and behaviors within these drivers. Obviously, there's some quantum technology advances that are making the news every day now that really are what we call disruptive technology, and that they really change and affect people's behavior and also economic dynamics and so forth. And then globalization is another trend or kind of mega trend that makes it very difficult for us to predict the future and be able to say with some assurance what we think is going to happen, because we all have models, but we also see how the models fail to predict significant disruptions. So again, scenario planning is a way to overcome that. So the fundamentals of how scenarios are built is start with drivers, and I'm going to talk more about that, and looking at levers, investments and policies that we can deploy, and that leads to outcomes. And that's maybe the essential heart of what we're doing in scenario planning. I want to put in a plug for those of you who are interested in scenario planning. You'll learn about this particular sketch planning approach that we're taking in VTRANS today, but there's some great resources out there. My teammate Hannah Twaddell with ICF International has helped author some of these guidances. There's an older scenario planning guidebook from 2011, and then two that are pretty brand new that you see on the right-hand side of the slide. And then Hannah's also working on a new publication for exploratory scenario planning that's underway right now. So be sure to check out those resources. And, so before I dive into what we're doing, I do want to set the stage a little bit and talk about some basic 2 to 3 different kinds of scenario planning that are done. On the left is a representation of normative and predictive scenario planning. This is really what's been done, particularly at a regional or quarter level over the last 20-plus years, in which you're honing on different preferences and values, shaping a vision, and then looking at alternatives and saying, how should we grow, what should happen, and you're saying one outcome is better than another. Variation on that is predictive scenario planning, where maybe you look at variations such as different investment scenarios and how they play out. But a newer type of scenario planning is exploratory scenario planning, where we're really just asking what could happen. And this is, kind of bubbling up out of this environment where it is more difficult to predict the long-term future. And this is where it's more of a discovery process. There's a lot of research that goes into it, and we're asking what-if questions. What if we grow much faster or slower? How might new technologies or other drivers change the game? And we're asking what could happen, so we have a range of outcomes. And that's the purpose of the exercise, not to say, oh, now which one do we pick, but rather what do we learn from this range of choices and how can we be prepared. So in setting up the process for VTRANS, we start with drivers and then we craft them into scenarios. I'll explain a little bit more about how we did that. Then once we have our scenarios and our drivers identified, we do a lot of research to develop assumptions about our inputs into the model. And we're using more research and some data to turn that information into outcomes. And then leads us to policy implications. And I'll be honest with you, we're about 7% of the way done with step 4 in the process. And what that means is, working through a series of presentations with the CTB, where we're walking them through some of the same material that you're seeing today. Pretty soon we'll be done with the outcomes, and then we'll be having a conversation about the policy implications. So I just want you to know we're not finished by any means. We're still working on this, and today's webinar is a great opportunity to hear from you and get more input on this process. And when we get way through the process, we have in mind a couple different ways to use the results. One is to ask, how resilient are the policies and investments that we're talking about elsewhere in VTRANS, and then also over time, how can we be responsive? If we see that one of the outcomes is starting to become reality, we're leaning in that direction, let's say in the range of outcomes, this exercise will help us be prepared for that and to be nimble and respond. So across the bottom of the slide are many different ways that the results could be used, and we hope there's even more. So let me start with the drivers, because I'm going to spend a lot of the emphasis in this presentation on how we did this, not as much, what the results are, because we're still working on the results, but also in this first presentation to this audience, if you're thinking about scenario planning, some of these ideas may be useful to you. So we started with drivers, looking at the 4 types that I mentioned earlier and how they relate to transportation outcomes. And we actually had an exercise that we did in the 2015 fall meetings where we put several drivers out on boards and we asked people to help us understand which ones have higher impact on transportation and which ones have the greatest uncertainty. And those are the drivers that make the most sense to focus on in the scenario planning exercise. So our outreach and input on this actually goes all the way back to that time period when we first started talking about those drivers. And at the other end of the process, we have a set of outputs that we're working towards in the sketch planning process. And so you see some of them relate to person travel, freight movement, total travel, and cost. And it's important to keep in mind we very intentionally have pursued a sketch planning approach for this project. We don't have a statewide land use model. We don't have a statewide transportation model quite yet. And a lot of the time, these scenario exercises are done in that quantitative environment. We're taking a sketch planning approach so we can keep the conversation at a little bit more of a higher level. And so when we get to our outputs, some of them will be quantitative, but for the most in relative terms. And many of them will be qualitative or even just directional. We can identify the things that will be increasing versus the things that will be decreasing. And again, a lot of it is still in that what-if framework. If this scenario plays out, if these assumptions play out, then this is what we could expect to happen. And in many ways, I think the most important thing that we're accomplishing is to have a conversation about these trends and what they mean. So, in kind of diving into the scenario planning process, we have some different tools in our toolbox, and I'm going to talk a little bit about these in a moment. I touched on drivers, so we've got drivers in those 4 different areas. Community types is another important element reason for that is that without doing that sort of fully modeled land use transportation exercise, we didn't want to completely lose that link between land use and transportation that's really important in scenario planning. Some of the early scenario planning really came out of that desire to better connect land use and transportation, and we wanted to have that element. Another tool is the generational composition of the population. We use that several different ways to help us organize our scenarios and use the data about those generations to help understand what might be happening differently in different scenarios. And then the mix of industries is really important. That has a big impact on what happens with respect to freight, and it also links to some of the other tools like the community types and the generation. So and I don't have a sketch planning tool that I can deliver to you when I'm done. We're doing the work in Excel, and a lot of it is being done truly as a sketch planning process. But so this is all figurative, I just want you to know. But these are all elements that we're actively using in the process. So I want to take a few minutes and talk specifically about the place types. These are important, I mentioned, because they give a link between transportation and land use in our sketch planning process. So we started with two key criteria, activity density, which is people plus jobs per acre, and then transit accessibility, which, in the earlier stages of VTRANS, we developed accessibility data statewide, and specific transit accessibility data, and that allowed us to help distinguish across these place types. Places have maybe a distinctly different mode split. One of the ways that we want to use the place types is to predict travel behavior in the future. And so when we defined them, we wanted them to be distinctly different, both in terms of their land use characteristics and also in terms of their transportation characteristics. So when we mapped them out, we came out with these 6 place types, and this is what the map looks like. And you can see that a lot of the area of Virginia is in that rural place type. But we have some punch-outs of some of the regional areas within the state. So you can see that there's, particularly within any given region or even small urban area in the state, there's some diversity of place types that you see. And this zooms in a little bit more on that. And again, what's important about the place types is that we're able to differentiate between them and understand that people in this community type will might use more bike and transit than people in another community type. They can have distinct demographics, distinct trip rates, and we found this really helpful when we were starting to think through the technology implications, that we could see technology like autonomous vehicles or mobility on demand, which is shared mobility, playing out a little bit differently in different place types. And I'm going to talk more about that later in the presentation. So this is a component, again, so at the end of this exercise, we're not going to say, well, this segment 95 is more congested in this scenario and less congested in this other scenario. We're going to keep it at this higher level, but we have this, at least this geographic dimension to it, to be able to have some understanding and insights in how different places of the state might be affected differently. So here we got our drivers defined, and we came up with the place type approach. We needed to craft the scenarios from the drivers, and I just want to talk about that a little bit. We agreed early on 4 scenarios, and we worked with our multi-modal advisory committee and some other groups on putting these together. And what we wanted to do was have 2 high-growth scenarios, one that's really maybe less urban, less high-tech economically, and has some features that would kind of drive VMT to the max, if you will. Then we have high-growth, high-tech, which shows us this scenario how we might have a higher growth future, but not maybe not have as much travel generation in this one. So that helped shape some of our assumptions there. Then we have a moderate growth scenario, and our multimodal advisory committee suggested in this one to look at what Virginia would look like with older demographics, an emphasis on people living in walkable places. And the last one is a reduced growth scenario where we focus on reduced federal spending and slower adoption of technology. So the idea is we want them each to be distinctly different. We don't want one to be the right one or the best one. We want them to be different from each other to an extent that we will learn from them. And then we did come up with these names that you'll see, later in the presentation, and you'll see these icons as well. So we have Industrial Renaissance, Techtopia, Silver Age, and General Slowdown are the names of our scenarios. I want to be clear that we didn't do them perfectly at the beginning of our process. There's a lot of research done as we moved through developing both the inputs and the outputs, and we continued to refine the scenarios because we needed to achieve both internal consistency, in other words, making sure that we didn't have two drivers in the same scenario that were sort of canceling each other out, and then also looking for a range of outcomes and trying to make sure that they would be distinctly different. So we have continued to refine the scenarios, and as we present them now, we've pretty much achieved those objectives of internal consistency and having a range of outcomes. So just really quickly, I'm going to give you a glimpse of a little bit more detail on these scenarios, and the slides will be available if you want to read more about this. But I went to the good stuff where we're talking about how we generated some of our inputs. And it's important to keep in mind, we have 4 scenarios for the future, but we actually have 5, and the 5th scenario is the baseline scenario. So we started by thinking about how those place types would play out in the future, and we actually had a data-driven process for that. And then we looked at trends in transportation modes and noticed that in some areas transit is increasing, in a lot of areas biking and telecommuting were increasing. So we carried some of those trends into the future, so we weren't just basing the baseline scenario on everything as it is today. We also found, and we looked at our economic models, that the shift to online retail and home delivery was already baked into the baseline economic scenario, so that's there too. And I'll talk more about the technology later. So then the high growth industrial has one assumption that we hear a lot of speculation about, which is that maybe the millennials will ultimately move to the suburbs the way earlier generations have done. And that would kind of keep the population distribution similar to what it is today, or similar to what it is in the baseline, actually. And then, but this has high-tech manufacturing in it, and that has some interesting implications. And this one has a high degree of AV implementation as well. I'm not saying as much. The economic drivers are in here, and the environmental drivers are important. In the interest of time, I'm not saying as much about those. I'm going to cover those in the next presentation to the CTV in June. It's not that they're not included. I'm trying to prioritize how I'm spending our time today a little bit. The next scenario is the high growth technology, or Techtopia. This one's straightforward. I think one thing that's distinct about this one is we do look for a surge in telecommuting in this one as an explicit assumption. Silver Age, we've got that older population. We're putting people into smaller, more walkable communities when we distribute the population to the place types. And one thing that's unique here is that we assume the autonomous vehicle implementation is high, but mobility and demand, the shared use approaches, are low. Just, again, to do something a little bit different that seems logically consistent with this scenario. Then general slowdown. We took more population out of the urban crescents in this one because that's where a lot of the federally driven jobs are and population. And then we assume slower implementation of autonomous vehicles and mobility on demand here. To give you an idea, so I just walked you through some of the trends relative to each scenario. If you look at the drivers and you map out the scenarios for each one, you can see we've got some good variation in how we looked at these. Particularly, I'll walk you through how we allocated the population across the place types in a little bit more detail in 1 minute. And with respect to autonomous vehicles, we look at autonomous and connected vehicle technology as sort of one driver, and then the mobility on demand as a separate driver. And the way that we looked at the scenarios is slightly different between the two. And that ends up being useful in creating meaningful differences between the scenarios when we look at their impact on travel demand and so forth. What I'm going to do now is walk you through how all of this comes together in a kind of one flowchart representation of the scenario process and its components. And then I'll give you an idea how far we can get through this into this webinar as well. So we started with employment. We have unique forecasts for each scenario, And then we link that to the population through a statistic that's called the labor force participation rate. That is a statistic that kind of allows you to illustrate how population tends to stay in balance with employment, particularly at a statewide level. So that allowed us to have variation in the population forecast as well. And then when we talk about the population drivers, the place types are very important. Then on the transportation side and those drivers, we have some explicit assumptions about mode split, autonomous vehicles, and mobility on demand. I'm going to go into some detail on those. Again, how we look at those in the future is also going to vary by place type, and that helps us both interpret the future with a little bit more confidence and also to help kind of crunch the numbers on how some of these will turn out differently. And those factors, along with the population employment, allow us to look at the question of how much demand is going to increase in the future, and it's vehicle mile travel and also to some extent person miles travel. And alongside that, we have to ask the question about what's going to happen to technology and efficiency, so in the end we have kind of a net increase in transportation demand for each scenario. And that's the very thing that we're working on right now. The other components of the total sketch planning process include looking at user costs and system costs, how the transportation and land use assumptions affect that, and then how freight is related to both the employment and population trends factor in. And freight's connected more fully throughout this, I think, than we can demonstrate in this without going to three dimensions. But that's in there as well. And we do also have the environmental and energy considerations. We have some distinct assumptions about each of those, and they primarily go in our sketch planning approach into the system cost and to some extent the user cost as well. So I'm not going to have time to get through all that today, but hopefully we can come back to this, and we will be going through these components sort of in the bottom half of this chart with the CTB in June. So let me take you through some of the details then, starting with that upper left corner. With our economic drivers, as I mentioned, we had a distinct economic forecast for each scenario using these trends and drivers within the economy. And this slide gives you an idea of how that plays out. On the left, you've got the total change in population from 2015 to 2040, including the baseline. So you see there's some variation. And then the graphic on the right compares each of the scenarios to the baseline. So when you kind of zoom in on those differences, what we achieved here is just a reasonable level of difference between the scenarios, one that we felt would show some real differences in the outcomes, but not be outside the realm of the believable or the possibility. And then, as I said, we linked those forecasts to the population, and we made a set of assumptions about population in terms of the generational groups and which ones would be more emphasized in the different scenarios, and also some assumptions about where they would live. So when you add up the population forecast for the scenarios, it looks like this. Again, on the left, you've got the total percent growth from 2015 to 2040, including the baseline. And on the right, you see how much variation we have relative to the baseline across our scenarios. And of course, these look just like the economic ones because, in relative terms, because we used a change in the employment forecast to help us create that change in population. So that's how that part of the scenario of the sketch planning worked. The next thing that we did, which is kind of fun, were population forecasts, was we distributed them differently across the place types for each scenario. So I want you to watch the purple bars in this chart, and hopefully the animation will not be too clunky over the internet. But so we about these place types as buckets, if you will, for the growth, not only the growth that's different between scenario, but also some of that baseline growth and how it might be allocated differently in each scenario. So industrial renaissance, we basically grew all of the place types similar to how they would be growing in the baseline. because we're assuming similar kinds of trends that we have in place today, like moving to the suburbs when you have a family, would occur in that scenario. In Techtopia, we reduced how much growth was going into the rural and suburban areas, and we focused more of the growth in the urban areas. In this scenario, we actually created a seventh place type that doesn't exist in Virginia, that is a high-density urban, something that you might see in a Philadelphia or a D.C. We don't really have in Virginia today. We allowed that to occur in this scenario. Silver Age, look in the middle, this is where we're emphasizing walkable places, and so we have more of the population focused in those small and multimodal suburban place types. And rural slowdown, as I mentioned, really would hit the urban crescent the hardest. So we sort of took the proportional population distribution urban crescent and lowered the growth in those areas. So you can see that there's a reduction over on the right-hand place types for that one. So this is an important step because then when we relate the transportation behaviors of each place type, this allocation is going to help us have some differences in the ultimate transportation outcomes when we crunch those numbers. And finally, on this topic, when you add those place types up together, the result of that exercise that I just showed you looks like this in a stacked bar chart. And so again, kind of seeing have we created some meaningful differences between the scenarios. Well, we've got 600,000 more people living in Virginia in scenarios 1 and 2 than in scenario 4, so that's a significant difference. And then really interesting is that about 900,000 more people live in the higher density place types in scenario 2 than scenario 4. So again, we've created some meaningful differences between the scenarios through this sketch planning approach. The next part of the presentation, and really much of the rest of our time, I want to talk about this, the mode split and how we tackled some of the technology drivers in our process, and just a taste of how that starts to shape up with respect to demand and throughput. So with respect to the mode split, we had to make some distinct assumptions about each scenario. A lot of the mode split results for each scenario come from that differentiation in how we allocated the population to the place type. So, for example, in Techtopia, we have more population in more urban place types. That allows transit and walking to increase. And for Techtopia, we have an explicit assumption that we want telecommuting to increase, so we threw that in as well. Similarly, in Silver Age, we put people in more walkable place types, so that will increase walking and biking. And this is just to kind of illustrate how that works. Now, ways that the place types come together with technology is in thinking about how people's behavior might be different with respect to automated and connected vehicles in the future in a rural area versus a more urban area. So in last year's fall meetings, 2016, we did a series of posters. We asked people where you want to live in 2040, and so you see the place types across the top. And then we have the same questions on the bottom, but we kind of allowed the people from the more rural areas to give their answers separately from the people who said they want to live in the more urban areas. And down below, we're asking, do you want to drive your own car? Do you want to drive your own autonomous vehicles? Would you like to be in a shared vehicle, or would you like to be in an automated vehicle driven by somebody else? And we see this correlation where the more urban place types are tending towards the more shared use approach and a little bit more autonomous, and the more rural place types still think they'd like to drive their own car or maybe have their own autonomous vehicle. This will come back to highlight how we started creating some assumptions about autonomous vehicles ability on demand. So that outreach was important. Another thing that was important was a whole bunch of research that SIR helped us with to really understand the state of understanding of technology, where we are now, where people think it's headed. And so there's a whole body of research on that, some of which has been shared in previous webinars. 2 points I want to make from that to help you understand how we made some of our assumptions. And one is that the rate of change is accelerating. If you look at this chart, it took 26 years for mass adoption of television, but 13 years, half of that, for mass adoption of mobile phones. So as we think about the future, that acceleration of adoption is important. secondly, this is more the supply side of that. The change is also accelerating in terms of the development of autonomous vehicles. The scale on this chart is automation. 0 is no automation, 5 is full automation. We don't have that yet. We don't have level 5 yet. The cars in this diagram represent where the manufacturers say they're going to be over time, and some of them are hesitant to say when they think they're really going to hit level 5. But what's compelling is that the tech industry has entered this market, and they've entered it at level 4. I was at the VTA conference yesterday with somebody from Local Motors who's doing 3D printing of level 4 autonomous shuttles, low-speed shuttles. Maybe you've heard of Ollie. And that's happening today, and they can build one in less than a month. And so it's really astonishing how the tech sector is getting involved on the supply, and we think that's going to accelerate as this comes on the scene. The good news is we're skipping out to 2040. We just need to know where we think we're going to be in 2040. We don't necessarily have to figure out how we get there. There's other planning processes working on that now, but for this scenario exercise, we just want to set predictions about where we'll be in 2040. So this chart shows you, between the outreach that we did and the research that we did, sort of where we landed and where we think technology adoption will be in 2040. And you'll see that we think the adoption for automation, which is the yellow line, is going to be higher than the adoption for mobility on demand, particularly in more rural areas. And that's consistent with what you saw in the outreach that we did. And then what we do with this line chart and these assumptions is that we move it up a little bit for the Techtopia scenario, and we move it down to a lower level of adoption for general slowdown. So this represents the baseline, but then we also vary how much we're assuming implementation in our sketch planning approach. So that plays out is that we look at the automated vehicle assumptions for most of the scenarios. We have it at a moderate level, but it's highest for Techtopia and lowest for general slowdown, and it's high for Silver Age. And this chart represents the implementation of mobility on demand, which is the ride services, and that ranges from a low of 50% to a high of 80% in our baseline, and then across the scenarios have the highest implementation in Techtopia and lowest in general slowdown, but then Silver Age is lower on this assumption than it was for automated vehicles. So next we have to say, now we have a sense of how much we're implementing those drivers. We have to ask, how are they affecting demand and throughput in our system? And what I'm going to do is just kind of give you the components of that discussion, and then where we're going next with this is actually putting more numbers to this. So when you think about the impact of technology, I think the research is pretty much in agreement that overall demand is going to go up, and it could go up quite a lot. And so we tried to isolate the components of that so that we could relate them to our scenarios. One component is induced mobility. So all the people who can't drive a car right now could get a ride in an autonomous vehicle, whether they're elderly, disabled, or young, too young to drive. So that's going to unleash a lot of demand. One of the factors that might really drive travel down a little bit is the greater efficiency in parking, in terms of not circulating to park, people getting dropped off at their destination in the car, making a simple trip to park, or if it's not your car, not parking at all and going on to make the next trip. But the flip side of that, perhaps, is an increase in demand that's related to maybe a mode of travel that we don't have today in the form of zero-occupant vehicles. So while the car is moving between passengers, or when you send it to go pick up your prescription for you, it's empty. And so, right now we balance our evidence of how many cars are on the road with how many people are making trips. This kind of throws a bit of a monkey wrench in that equation. Another thing that a lot of people talk about that we think is valid is the idea that in some areas, these trends will lead some people to have longer commutes because they can do other things while they're in the car. And then another factor is more short trips, just from the convenience factor. And if you're in the middle of cooking dinner and you need something, you can't stop cooking and go get it. You make do, or you send your teacher if you have one, but now you can just send your car and to make that short trip, and so the convenience factor could also drive up demand. So overall, there's a lot of factors within automated and connected vehicles that will drive up demand, but there are some offsetting principles. And when you look at it across the place types, it could be quite different. These are just some initial potential numbers that if you looked at the future with high degree of implementation of automation relative to a baseline, didn't have automation, you could see a lot of growth in demand, particularly in less urban areas, because of the dependency on single occupant vehicle trips overall, and the fact that you don't get as much efficiency and demand from things like the reduction in circulation for parking in the areas where you do some of those benefits in the urban areas. So this is just a preliminary concept. We're still crunching the numbers on how this plays out, both across the place types and then, of course, with those different assumptions by scenario. Now, this is also an important component in the future. Transit could become more affordable, available, and conventional because of these technologies, because of the cost-effectiveness of having at the transit conference yesterday, people were using the analogy of maybe you don't have a driver, but you have like a concierge on the vehicle. So that person is monitoring fare collection and other things, and just making sure the vehicle is working. You also, through technology, will have a more streamlined and efficient work. And in places where there's a reason, like a premium on space, for example, in more urban areas, there's still very compelling reasons to have people sharing rides. And so one way of looking at it is there will be a spectrum of transit services in the future. In areas where you still have high concentrations of population, you're going to need those fixed route, high capacity services. Nothing's ever going to move people more efficiently than that. At least, it'll still be valid in that environment. But then, at the other end of the spectrum, there will be demand responsive, lower capacity services that may be more customized and more cost effective because of technology. So this is, we're still kind of doing the crystal ball thing here as we think about how this plays out in transit. But through research and input, these ideas seem to hold water. Freight is another important mode that we're thinking about in this process, and how it relates to technology is very significant. I think we've all been talking about truck platooning for a long time, but this is really starting to become within the realm of the foreseeable. And then the different models of delivery and integrating freight with drone delivery and those kinds of things could happen. Another factor that could make freight delivery more efficient is an idea that was just announced last week, of a concept of Uber Freight, where you've got a service like Uber connecting empty freight vehicles with freight that needs to move, and getting more effectiveness, fewer empty trucks on the road, and that drives up efficiency, which is great. Efficiency is the other side of the coin. So we see a lot of trends in technology and in the future that would drive up demand, and that could be very dystopian if we just simply have more and more and more travel. But there's another side to that, in that technology and aspects of our future transportation system and network can be a lot more efficient. And one of the fundamental questions is really, how do you keep those in balance? So some of the components to the efficiency side of the equation are safety. Safety is going to reduce a lot of better safety will reduce a lot of congestion, although honestly it will probably also induce a little more demand too. The information is critical. People knowing what their choices are across modes and having real-time information on trip making will really improve efficiency and reliability. Is another component. For example, surge pricing with the mobility on demand services makes predictability of those trips a little bit tricky, and so it's important to have other modes of transportation available. Some of you may have had an experience in a city of taking an Uber on your way out for the evening and then walking or using a bus to come back because the surge pricing kicks in. So that's kind of like congestion pricing. pricing, which is exciting to think that that will help manage congestion on our system. But it also highlights how important it is to have other modes available for people to travel on, so that pricing doesn't spin control for some people. The vehicle-to-vehicle or vehicle-to-infrastructure aspect will increase a lot of efficiency in terms of cars being able to travel closer together. Maybe where we have 3 lanes on the highway, in the future we'll have 4 because of the improved safety and operations. And then 5G will bring us to V2X, which is vehicle to everything. Everything in communication with everything else, and maybe opening up space in urban roadways where what we think of as a more chaotic model is actually more efficient in how the modes work together. But it all boils down to having more throughput out of the system that we have and designing it in a way that maximizes throughput. So for the sketch planning approach, what we're doing is we're making some assumptions based on research about how technology would affect different types of roads. And it seems like the interstates and the arterial network have the most potential to have significant increases in throughput with technology in place. So we've analyzed that. Again, we go back to the place types and we've used GIS data to capture how much of the network falls into those 2 categories. And this allows us to make assumptions. If we want to assume there's a 50% increase in capacity on arterials and a 60 or 70% increase on interstates, we can use this data to help us that back into our place types and our scenarios. So I just wanted you to see that component of the sketch planning as well. But it boils down to this question of will demand and system throughput change in tandem with each other, like you see on the right, or out of sync with each other, like you see on the left or in the middle. And in this first discussion we had with the CTB in April, this generated some real discussion, and this is where we have to start thinking about the outcomes. So and what it means. So for where we are in our process right now is continuing to crunch the numbers on the outcomes, and our next series of presentations will focus on results for these scenarios. And this slide captures the different things that we're now pulling together to look at that. And then that will allow us to give some results with respect to these outputs that I described earlier. And then, again, to ask these important questions at a higher level. What does it mean for the resilience of our transportation investments? What kind of policies might we want to be working towards? And this slide provides some questions that we put in front of the CTV just, to have the conversation. Because at the end of the day, I think the most important thing that we're doing in this scenario process is have a conversation about how the future may play out with these disruptive technologies, with these disruptive trends, thinking about what is that we need to be prepared for in terms of both policies and investments to be resilient and to capture the right strategies for the range of outcomes that may occur in the future. That's the end of this presentation. Our next step will be to continue working on the outputs, bring some of that information to the CTV in June. That's tentative. It's not final yet. And then we also plan to launch some online outreach broadly to bring some of this information and ask people what they think about these trade-offs and some of the strategies that we should be thinking about in response to them. That concludes my presentation, and I think we have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions.
Anybody any questions for Lorna?
Hello, Nova has a question.
Okay, go ahead, Nova.
Okay, go ahead.
This is Tina Dabistoni with Transportation Planning Nova VDOT. Question is there a factor other than cost that allows autonomous transit to be in demand? That there are going to be autonomous vehicles. Who would take autonomous bus trips? My question.
Yeah, question. We've thought about that quite a bit, and a lot of people in the industry are asking that question too. And again, it comes down to not just cost of the vehicle, but also cost of the urban space. You know, one of the reasons that we have transit in urban areas, we have the really high capacity transit, is because we want to have a more efficient way for people to move, you know, through common origins and destinations. And so I don't think that our team doesn't really think that will be different. It might operate differently in the future, particularly how that transit connects to last mile transportation could be different, maybe even more efficient with autonomous vehicles. But that's one reason and one aspect, is that in the urban space, just a tremendous efficiency that you get from transit. Another is when you think about people's choices, you know, if demand is really driven through the roof with this technology being deployed, people, you know, and maybe this speaks to your point, you know, people will have to choose between their own autonomous vehicle trip and a shared autonomous trip. And so we think that just as people are choosing, you know, between those, there's good reason to think they will in the future. And then as a society, we may need to think about the importance of keeping some modes available for those pricing issues that I was talking about earlier, and then that's a public policy decision that we want to make sure that from an equity perspective and affordability perspective, that these modes remain in play so that people really do have choices.
Any questions for Lorna? Yeah. There's a question that's in the chat box that says, using, scroll back up to it, we get, so you mentioned that the analysis was done using sketch planning tool in Excel, etc. Will there be an opportunity for those tools to be shared with MPOs as we develop scenario planning approaches to learn from the assumptions, calculations that went into this work?
And so the answer is we absolutely want this to be an open book, and we're working on documenting it in a way, you know, it might ultimately be just a big PowerPoint deck that includes step-by-step what some of those assumptions were. And then, you know, if there's a demand for a sketch planning tool version of this, that's something we could discuss with OIPI as a separate activity when we're done. But certainly if somebody's working concurrently and wants some insight into that, once we arrive at a certain level of agreement that we've done it correctly for this exercise, I'm sure OIPI would want us to share it any way that we could to help you, you know, see what those assumptions were and perhaps make use of it yourself.
Another question. If there's no further questions, you can always feel free to email Lorna or Robin Greer with your questions or myself, and I will make sure they get forwarded to the correct person. This presentation is being recorded today, so a copy of the recording will be available later on in the week. Lorna, thank you for today and educating us more.
Thank you. It was great fun.
And thank you to everyone for joining today.